Once, at a lavish evening gathering in a grand mansion outside New York, a wealthy man cruelly mocked a cleaning woman right in front of all the guests. And no one there understood that they were about to witness something far greater than just another piece of drawing room amusement. The music drifted softly and quietly. Crystal shimmered beneath the heavy chandeliers. Richard Harrison moved among his guests with the calm assurance of a man who had spent far too many years believing that everything around him belonged to him by right. Helen Carter collected empty glasses with the practiced efficiency of someone who had long ago learned to pass through other people's luxury without leaving a trace, a shadow, or a sound. She moved quietly, steadily, without a single unnecessary motion, until her gaze suddenly stopped on an antique violin displayed beside the fireplace. The instrument was mounted in a dark wooden frame and hung apart from everything else, like a rare relic, like something admired in that house but almost never truly heard. Helen Carter slowed her step. She did not touch the violin. She did not even come too close. She simply looked at it longer than, apparently, a woman in her position was supposed to look at something on a night when she was meant to clean up after others. Richard Harrison noticed. He always noticed when someone stepped outside the invisible choreography he liked to impose on the people around him. He broke off his conversation mid-sentence, raised his glass slightly, and pointed straight at her. "Are you staring at me?" he said, "or do you think you can steal the violin with your eyes alone?" Several guests laughed before they had even fully processed what he had said. Helen Carter turned her face toward him and gripped the tray more tightly. The whole room seemed to arrange itself around the scene. Richard Harrison liked that. He approached slowly, wearing that thin, sharp smile and using the soft voice he especially loved in moments when he wanted to humiliate someone without shouting, without descending into open vulgarity. "Have you ever seen a Stradivarius this close?" he asked. "Or did you assume it was just another decoration on the wall?" The laughter came again. Helen Carter looked once more at the violin. There was something in her gaze, something too deep to be mere curiosity. She answered quietly, almost to herself. "I just thought it was beautiful." Richard Harrison immediately repeated her words louder so everyone could hear. "She says it's beautiful." He turned to the guests. "Did you hear that? Our cleaning woman finds a violin worth several $1 million beautiful." A man in a gray suit beside him laughed louder than anyone else. Margaret Wilson, in a gold dress, lifted one eyebrow and stepped forward, as if she too wanted a closer place in the little performance. Richard Harrison smirked. "And do you know what would really be beautiful? If you played it. If you can, I'll marry you right here in front of everyone." The guests burst into laughter. Someone was already holding up a phone. Someone else watched in silence with that particular kind of pleasure people feel when cruelty has chosen someone else as its target. Helen Carter felt heat rise to her face, but she did not lower her head. For several seconds she looked at Richard Harrison, and then she asked the one question no one expected. "May I have the violin?" The laughter stopped at once. Richard tilted his head slightly, as if he could not believe what he had heard, and then his smile widened even more. He walked to the wall, removed the instrument from its mounting, and placed it into her hands with no care at all. "Well then," he said. "Show us." The weight of the wood settled into Helen's palm and awakened a memory that had not returned to her whole in many years. A small room in the back of a public school. The smell of coffee mixed with varnish. Jonathan Miller patiently adjusting her elbow and telling her that a violin was not luxury, it was language. At 8 years old, she could already draw a clean tone from an open string. At 12, she had stepped onto a stage in Boston and seen her father, Samuel Carter, sitting in the front row in the best jacket he owned. When she finished playing, he wept openly. On the way home, he told her it had been the happiest night of his life. 2 months later, he was gone. After that, life began closing doors one after another. It became too hard for Gloria Carter to carry everything alone. The lessons ended. The violin was wrapped in an old cloth and placed in the bottom of a closet. At first Helen promised herself it would only be for a little while. Later, she stopped making promises. By 15, she was already working. By 20, she was cleaning other people's homes where no one even guessed that her hands had once learned scales, toots, and sonatas. By 30, she had almost taught herself how to survive without touching that part of her own fate. And now the instrument had returned to her fingers with an almost painful familiarity. "Well," Richard Harrison said. "Play. Or do you want me to call someone over to show you how to even hold it?" Arthur Mitchell, who was overseeing the musical side of the evening, noticed the movement and stepped closer. He was a tall man with gray hair, a severe gaze, and the posture of someone who had devoted decades to the discipline of sound. When he saw the violin in Helen Carter's hands, his brows drew together. "That instrument is not a toy for a party," he said. "It should be returned to its place." Helen took a deep breath. Her body had already begun to remember before her mind could catch up. Her chin found its point of support on its own. Her left hand found the fingerboard. Her fingers, roughened by years of work, trembled for only a moment. 15 years lay heavy on them. 15 years without a bow, without repetition, without a teacher. Without a stage. Without courage. Richard Harrison stood there with his arms crossed, thoroughly pleased with what was happening. "What are you waiting for?" he asked. "A miracle." But before Helen could answer, one of the servers rushed past and brushed her shoulder. The tray she still held slipped from her hand and crashed to the floor. The glasses shattered across the marble into dozens of glittering shards. For a moment, the noise split the attention of the whole room, but no one moved to help. Still holding the violin, Helen instinctively crouched down and began gathering the broken glass with her free hand. Richard Harrison watched from above. Margaret Wilson exchanged a mocking glance with the woman beside her. Someone's phone was still recording. The scene seemed to gather Helen's entire life into one instant. Even while she was being humiliated in public, people still expected her to clean up the mess first. When she stood again, Arthur Mitchell was already closer than before. Something in his face had changed. It was not pity. It was attention. He had noticed the way she had held the violin in the middle of chaos. People who know nothing of an instrument hold it with fear. People who know it hold it with respect. "Did you play before?" he asked quietly. "A long time ago," Helen Carter answered. Richard Harrison heard that and gave a short laugh. "Wonderful. So now we have an artistic past as well." The evening gets more interesting by the minute. Helen did not look at him. She looked again at the violin, and for one brief moment the room disappeared. There were no chandeliers, no broken glass, no expensive dresses, no smile on Richard Harrison's face. There was only the wood beneath her chin and her father's voice crossing the years as if he were standing beside her. "The violin never forgets those who loved it, sweetheart. It only waits for the moment they remember." The words returned with such clarity that Helen could almost feel her father adjusting her fingers again. She closed her eyes for a second. And when she opened them, everything was still there. Richard Harrison, certain of himself, the people around him, ready to enjoy her failure. Margaret Wilson with that faint smile, the man in the grey suit positioning his phone more carefully, Arthur Mitchell watching in silence and with full attention. And then Helen Carter understood that this was no longer only about whether she would play or not. It was about something else. Once again, she was being pushed toward that invisible zone where she had lived for years, the place where no one really saw her, and where even she herself had begun to believe she belonged. Slowly, she raised a bow. Not a single note had sounded yet, but something in the room had already changed. Because for the first time that entire evening, Helen Carter no longer looked like a cornered employee standing in the middle of someone else's celebration. She looked like someone about to open a door whose existence no one in that room had ever suspected. And though no one understood it yet, from that very breath onward, the evening had begun slipping forever out of Richard Harrison's hands. The first note came out softly, but firmly enough not to dissolve into the air. It was not perfect. But it was not weak. It was alive. The bow trembled slightly, not from incompetence, but from the force of a reunion that demanded courage. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. Richard Harrison tilted his head, waiting for the mistake. Margaret Wilson folded her arms, waiting for the perfect moment to laugh. The man in the grey suit brought his phone even closer. Helen breathed in again, more deeply now, and drew a second sound from the strings. Her fingers began to find their places with that kind of precision that does not come from conscious memory, but from something older, something carved into the body itself. The body remembered. Her right hand adjusted the weight of the bow. Her wrist softened. The third note sounded cleaner. By the fourth, there was intention in it. Arthur Mitchell narrowed his eyes. He knew that sound. This was not chance. Not an awkward improvisation. This was technique waking up after years buried under silence. Richard Harrison was still smiling, but a faint tension had already appeared at the corners of his mouth. He was waiting for everything to collapse in a few seconds. Waiting for an obvious error, a humiliating break, an embarrassing stumble. But the mistake did not come. On the contrary, the music was beginning to take shape. Helen Carter no longer saw anyone. The room receded again. The marble floor, the costly fabrics, the chandelier light, all of it faded away. In its place rose the wooden floor of a small hall, an old stage from the past, and the figure of her father in the front row. She did not need to see him with her eyes. He was there. She moved further into the musical phrase, more confidently now. The transitions between the notes became smoother. The sound stopped being merely correct. It became expressive. One of the women by the wall slowly lowered her phone. The man in the grey suit stopped laughing. Margaret Wilson did not even notice that she had uncrossed her arms. Richard Harrison lowered his too. Nothing was going according to his plan. Helen Carter kept playing. The bow no longer trembled. Her right hand found a balance between firmness and lightness. Her left hand moved more freely now. The strings responded. The instruments seemed to recognize her touch. Each note took its place in the air as though it had always belonged in that room. Arthur Mitchell stepped forward. He recognized the piece. He recognized the path she had chosen. It was not a simple melody. Not some easy tune one could use to impress a shallow crowd. It was difficult. Risky. Helen Carter was not pretending to know how to play. She was truly playing. The silence in the room changed its meaning. At first it had been the silence of waiting for failure. Now it was the silence of attention. One guest stood up. Then another. Not out of politeness, but out of some inner impulse. There was something in what was happening now that no longer allowed the comfortable posture of a detached spectator. Richard Harrison tightened his grip on the glass in his hand. The smile on his face lost its natural ease. He glanced around and suddenly realized that people were no longer looking at him. That almost never happened to him. He tried to reclaim control of the room. "That's enough," he said, taking a step forward. Helen Carter did not stop. The music continued, clearer, stronger, surer. "I said enough," Richard repeated, louder now. But no one moved to support him. Arthur Mitchell lifted a hand slightly, not to stop the music, but like a man asking for silence from someone who is trying to interrupt something far more important than himself. Richard Harrison caught that gesture and froze for a second. This feeling was new to him. He was not being obeyed. Helen entered a more difficult passage. Her fingers ran with precision. Yes, there were still small imperfections in her playing, natural, human ones. But the essence remained untouched. The sound carried truth. It was not the desire to dazzle. It was truth. One woman pressed her hand to her chest. An older man in a dark tie nodded slowly, as if he had recognized something rare. The young man who had been filming lowered his phone for a few seconds, unable to decide what mattered more. To keep recording, or simply to listen. Richard Harrison looked at Margaret Wilson. She was no longer smiling. He looked around at the rest of the guests. No one was laughing. No one was waiting for her to fail. All of them were caught in the grip of the music. Helen Carter approached the most intense part of the piece. The bow gained strength. The sound filled the room in a way no speaker system ever could. It was direct. Alive. Human. Richard Harrison did not even notice when he stepped back. The music was taking over the very space that had once belonged only to him. When Helen entered the final variation, something changed completely. This was no longer a question of technique. It was a question of surrender. In every movement lived the years of silence she had carried inside her, the years of postponed life, the story that had finally found its way out. Now the whole room was standing. Richard Harrison was not. The final sequence rang out with a precision that surprised even Arthur Mitchell. He knew perfectly well how much control that passage required. Helen did not falter. She carried the phrase true to the end, firm, gathered, honest. The final note hung in the air. Silence followed. 1 second. 2. Then came the first applause. Loud. Separate. Real. Then a second. Then another. And within moments the entire room was applauding, without irony, without doubt, without hesitation. This was recognition. Helen Carter slowly lowered the bow. Her hands were trembling. Not from fear. From release. As if a circle she had never even had time to understand when it first broke had finally closed. Richard Harrison stared at her without expression. His calculation had failed. Arthur Mitchell came toward her slowly. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. "Helen Carter." He nodded. "I knew I had heard a sound like that before." Richard Harrison tried to interfere. He stepped forward and forced a smile. "Very beautiful. Truly. Very beautiful." Unexpected. No one answered him. So he continued. "But let's remember that this was only a lucky moment. It changes nothing. From the back of the room came the voice of the older man in the dark tie. "No," he said. "It changes everything." After those words, Richard Harrison fell silent. For the first time that entire evening, he had no prepared answer. Helen Carter did not even look at him. She no longer needed to. Everything that needed to be said, the music had already said for her. She walked to the wall and carefully returned the violin to its place. For a moment, she let her hand rest on the wood, as if thanking the instrument. Then she stepped back. Arthur Mitchell watched her attentively. "How many years had it been since you last played?" 15. A faint smile touched his lips. "Then you lost nothing. You were only waiting." Helen nodded quietly. Richard Harrison stepped aside. He took his coat. He spoke to no one. His departure was not accompanied by an announcement, by attention, or by applause. It was quiet, exactly as it should have been from the beginning. Helen Carter took a deep breath. The room still held the echo of what had happened. Several people were already moving toward her with praise and admiration, but she did not stay to receive it. She had not been looking for that. She took her coat and headed toward a side door. This time not as a person no one noticed, but as someone who had finally been seen. And even more importantly, as someone who had begun once again to see herself. The night air felt colder when Helen stepped outside the mansion gates, but for the first time in many years she did not feel the familiar weight on her shoulders. There was no rush in her step, no desire to look back. Inside, the evening still continued, the lights still burned, conversations were returning to their rhythm. And yet something had changed beyond repair, even if no one could yet fully explain what. She walked silently down the sidewalk, pulling her coat close around herself, while the memory of the music still lived in her fingers. It was not only sound. It was the feeling of belonging once more to something that had always been hers and should never have disappeared from her life. That same night, when she returned to her old apartment, Helen Carter opened the closet in the corner of the room. The box was still there, exactly where she had left it many years ago. She slowly knelt down, removed the old cloth, and saw the violin she had kept since childhood. She ran her fingers over the wood so gently that it seemed she was returning to herself a part that had never truly vanished. She sat on the edge of the bed, placed the instrument on her shoulder, and slowly drew the bow across the strings. The first note sounded steadier than it had in the mansion. Not perfect, but honest. And that was enough. A few days later, the story began to spread. Someone uploaded the recording. People talked about it, shared it, argued over it, sent it to one another. But Helen Carter did not follow any of that. She no longer needed to. The most important change was not happening on screens or in the opinions of strangers. It was happening here, in her own hands. Because in the end, everything had been changed not by Richard Harrison's bet. Everything had been changed by her choice not to walk away. And the inner transformation did not end there. The next morning, Helen Carter woke earlier than usual. Outside, it was a gray suburban New York morning. Pale moisture clung to the window, and the room looked just as modest as it had the day before. The old wardrobe, the narrow bed, the small table, the kettle in the kitchen, the faded curtains, the familiar silence. And yet, for the first time in a very long while, she felt that she was not waking into the same life she had dragged behind her for years, but into a space where something personal could exist again. She made tea, set the cup on the table, and sat looking for a long time at the violin lying beside her in its open case. Only days earlier, the very sight of it had tightened her chest with pain, as a reminder of what had been lost. Now the feeling was different. The pain remained. But alongside it came a quiet clarity. Not everything had disappeared. Not everything was too late. Helen carefully picked up the violin and once again drew the bow across the strings. The sound came out uneven. Her fingers still did not obey as they had the night before, in the moment of intense inner uplift. But she did not become discouraged. On the contrary, the slight roughness in the sound calmed her. It meant there was still a path ahead. Not a spark. Not a miracle. Not a dramatic evening for the amazement of strangers. A real path back. During the day, her phone rang several times. A neighbor said she had seen some video and thought she recognized Helen in it. A former coworker forwarded a message from someone who had heard about the woman with the violin at the rich man's party. Helen answered briefly and calmly. She was not trying to hide. She simply no longer wanted to live inside other people's reactions. That evening, Arthur Mitchell called her. At first she did not know how he had gotten her number. Perhaps someone from the serving staff had helped. Perhaps he had asked the hosts. His voice was just as steady and restrained as before. Helen Carter, this is Arthur Mitchell. I hope I'm not disturbing you. No. I wanted to ask if you would allow me to meet with you. Without noise. Without an audience. Just to talk. She was silent for a moment. About what? About music. And about the fact that not everything should remain in the past just because time has passed. There was no pressure in his words. Only respect. And for that very reason, she agreed. They met 2 days later in a small hall attached to a music school in New York. The room was modest, with old chairs, music stands, and a worn wooden floor. It reminded Helen of the places where her childhood had begun. Arthur Mitchell asked no unnecessary questions. He did not pry into her poverty. He did not try to draw a confession out of her. He did not speak much about the night in the mansion. Instead, he simply said, "Play something. However you can. Not for me. For yourself." She played. At first carefully, then with more confidence. Not everything came easily. Some passages broke apart under faster technique. Her fingers still could not always reach where memory wanted them to go. At times her breathing lost its rhythm. But Arthur Mitchell listened the way one listens not to an accident, but to a person. When she finished, he said, "The foundation is alive in you. Very alive. Far less has been lost than you think." Helen looked away. "I'm not 12 anymore. I'm not the girl they once brought onto a stage." "Of course you are not," he answered calmly. "You are more than that now. Back then you had school. Now you have life. And in music, that can be heard more strongly than many people understand." She said nothing. But those words stayed with her. The following weeks were a strange time for her. By day she still worked. She wiped surfaces, collected cups, washed floors, just as before. The world had not been overturned in a single moment. Her bills had not vanished. Neither had her fatigue. But in the evenings, she opened the case. And each evening she reclaimed a little more of what she had once been forced to leave behind. Sometimes her fingers hurt. Sometimes she thought it was too late. Sometimes one crooked passage was enough to ruin her mood for the whole night. But then she remembered not the applause in the mansion, but that first note that had refused to disappear into the air. That was enough to keep going. Meanwhile, The recording of that evening kept spreading. People wrote all kinds of things. Some were moved. Others argued about whether it had been real. Some discussed Richard Harrison, his tone, his exit, his awkward defeat. Others tried to find Helen Carter, wanting to invite her to television programs, interviews, recordings, to turn her story into a spectacle once again. But she still responded to almost none of it. Not out of fear. Simply because, for the first time in her life, she understood clearly that not all attention truly makes a person seen. What was real was something else. A quiet evening. A lamp above the table. The bow in her hand. The violin on her shoulder. Her own concentration. The growing steadiness of the sound. And the feeling that she was slowly ceasing to live at the edge of her own destiny. One evening, Gloria Carter, long accustomed to her daughter's silent exhaustion, stepped into the room and froze in the doorway when she heard the music. She said nothing at first. She simply stood there, holding the doorframe, listening. When Helen finished, silence settled in the room. "I thought you'd never take it out again," her mother said at last, quietly. Helen lowered her eyes. "So did I." Gloria came closer, ran her fingers along the edge of the table, and said, "Your father would have been happy." There was no drama in the words. Only simple truth. And perhaps because of that, they sounded stronger than any applause. Another month passed. Arthur Mitchell would sometimes invite her to an empty hall. Not as a student who needed to be rescued, but as a musician who only needed help returning to her own voice. He corrected details, reminded her about her breathing, her right wrist, the need not to tighten her shoulder. But the most important thing was not even his advice. It was that he treated her seriously. And that gradually began to rebuild something inside Helen Carter. One day he proposed that she perform at a small chamber evening at the school. Not in a luxurious mansion. Not in front of a condescending crowd. Just in an ordinary hall where people had truly come to listen to music. At first she refused. Then she asked for time to think. And a week later, she said, "All right." That evening, the hall was very small. A few rows of chairs. A modest stage. No chandeliers. No glitter. No gold dresses. Not a single person who wanted to laugh at her. Only ordinary faces. Quiet expectation. Silence. Helen Carter walked onto the stage without the feeling that she had to prove anything to anyone. It was a new feeling. That night in the mansion outside New York, she had played like a person cornered and humiliated, who had refused to vanish. Now she played like a person who had chosen to remain inside her own voice. And when the first note sounded, she understood the most important thing. What had truly mattered had not happened that night among crystal, wealth, and other people's smirks. The real change had happened afterward. In the quiet days. In the repetitions. In the return. In the small courage of each next day. Because sometimes life changes not when an entire room rises to its feet and applauds. Sometimes it changes when a person is left alone with themselves, takes into their hands the thing they were once forced to abandon, and still decides to begin again.